Company man woke me up. Said you'd need ferry to the Obra Dinn. Not many eager for that job. Seems a bit late if you ask.
I didn't.
What's in the box?
I don't know. I'll hoist it up in a few minutes.
Hey! How?
Carefully.
One of my favorite game genres is funky puzzle games, which is more or less a term that I made up to describe puzzle games that don't really align with what a more standard puzzle game would be. Like, sure, you've got your Tetrises and your Sokobans and your Bejeweleds and your escape room games, but for me there's just nothing that hits harder than a game that's clearly a puzzle, but is unconventional in the construction of said puzzles. I think it's because they make this active choice to break away from known types of puzzles by trying to do something that hasn't existed before. You know, puzzles are a thing that have been around in some shape or form probably since time immemorial. I'm sure there was some guy in Mesopotamia who liked to tell riddles in between bullshit copper sales that people would ponder over, but it's when something novel is able to break through and carve out a whole new niche that I think puzzles really have an opportunity to thrive. Return of the Obra Dinn, in my opinion, is the pinnacle of this as far as puzzle video games go. In the years since its release, games like The Case of the Golden Idol and The Root Trees Are Dead have shown that this weird little niche of funky puzzle games has a ton of potential which it's continually able to reach. All of that can be attributed, though, to the foundation of this new wave, if not the whole funky puzzle game genre, which is, of course, Return of the Obra Dinn. Now, all that being said, I'm of the admittedly pretty stupid opinion that no matter how important a piece of media may be to a genre or medium, it still has to succeed on its own merits to really be worthwhile. So it's a good thing that Return of the Obra Dinn is one of the best games ever made. Before I really dig into what actually makes Obra Dinn such a great game, though, I think it's important to talk about the game that came before it, Papers, Please. Compared to Obra Dinn, Papers, Please isn't exactly a marvel of gameplay. As a matter of fact, the whole point of the game is that it isn't an exciting game. You're just a customs official, that's all you do, nothing else. It's just inspecting documents for the vast majority of the time. Let's be 100% for real here, that should be boring as fuck, and frankly sometimes it is, but it's that overwhelming sense of boredom that'll inevitably creep in that lets the game really shine. When you're just inspecting documents normally and a creepy-ass hooded guy shows up in your booth with only one eye creeping out of the hood, if it even is an eye, the tension of the scenario is immediately ratcheted up. Entering your booth on what seems to be a normal day, only to be greeted by a man straight out of Schindler's List who was lurking there before you even showed up for work asking about the hooded guys makes everything feel even more tense, and you're just watching all these absolutely insane things play out around you. Assassination plots, human traffickers, smugglers, suicide bombings, all of it is happening around your stupid little office while you're just there trying to process as many passports as possible to afford your rent. It's this contrast, this balance between the mundanity of your job and the month-long collapse of our Statska that makes Papers, Please so compelling. There's virtually nothing more immersive than this. The barrier between you the player and you the character in the game is completely shattered as you start to spend your whole workday thinking about the absolutely crazy shit that's going on by the border checkpoint. As the paperwork that you have to sift through becomes more and more detailed, the story's piling up right alongside it, so you're slipping up on your work far more because, come on, who cares if the seal is forged? I've literally just been asked to assassinate some guy in line later today. Screwing up, though, comes with a major risk in the form of docked pay, as does going too slow and failing to process enough entrants on any given day. You have a family to take care of. There are 4 and eventually 5 people living with you, all of whom rely on your job as border security to live, and it becomes more and more unsustainable to handle them. Even if you do what's arguably the optimal strat in feeding them and turning on the heat on alternating days, you're still going to have to contend with rent being an issue, not to mention climbing more and more if you choose to upgrade your apartment while your salary stagnates. Seriously, what kind of dumbass thought that a job that deals with matters of national security should be commission-based? I mean, that'd be like if cops had to hit quotas for the number of tickets handed out every month or something. It just wouldn't make sense. Back on topic, you feel everything in the game as if it's happening directly to you. When somebody jumps the border wall and you have to try and tranquilize them, you're gonna feel a little jump as the alarm starts blaring in the middle of you seeing if the issuing city of a passport's properly spelled, and then you're gonna feel even more tense as you line up your extremely limited shots at the wall hopper charging your good friend Sergey because you've seen those guards in that exact spot get blown up at least twice. You get a rush poisoning a guy's passport at the behest of the secret revolutionary group, and then as you see him walk out of the booth, cough up blood, and spread the poison to a guard that approached to help him, you can't help but feel guilty about what you did. Shooting into a crowd on their orders to kill a target is similar. Previously, when you've shot, it's just been tranquilizer rounds, so you assume that shooting to kill won't be any different, only to feel guilty when you shoot through the target and into the random innocents in line behind him. Everything is in service of making you completely immersed in your role as the booth guy, and it's done so flawlessly that I think you might not be human if you don't feel anything at all while playing this game. Whether it's disdain towards your asshole boss, or relief at seeing Georgie Gustava come through the booth with another stupid scheme to get into our Statska, or like mild annoyance at the guy who you made a deal with to get a cut of his bonus for detaining suspicious entrants trying to keep some of the money from you, you are the booth officer, and by the end of the game it feels like you're directly responsible for all of the choices that led to the fate of you, your family, and our Statska at large. Papers, Please is an absolute classic, a masterclass in designing immersion, and if you're a freak that likes clerical work like me, it's pretty fun too. I've been chasing the dragon of finding another game like Papers, Please for years, one that has a similar style of gameplay and as strong of a tone, but nothing has ever come close to how uniquely great the original is. They'll miss the forest for the trees, seeing that Papers, Please has you dealing with mundane tasks while occasionally interrupting you with something that changes up the tone of the experience, but fail to recognize that what makes Papers, Please so great is that everything in the game, be it the visual style or the sound design or the brusqueness that everyone speaks with, contributes to nailing down such an incredibly immersive, compelling experience. Continuing on in Papers, Please's style of the protagonist working boring desk jobs, Return of the Obra Dinn has you playing as an insurance adjuster for the British East India Company, investigating what happened to the titular ship. It washed up without any crew on board, so it falls to you to figure out some way to piece together how this happened, where they all disappeared to, what brought the boat back, or maybe it's an elaborate prank and all 60 of the people aboard at the Obra Dinn's departure have been hiding in the lazarette for the last 4 years, and that skeleton on the deck is just from Party City. We do this with a magical pocket watch that allows you to see into the past, given to us by a man named Henry Evans, who we can also see in the crew manifest if we look closely, and a book in which we can record the details of those who met their fates as part of the Obra Dinn's final voyage. Rather than Papers, Please's style of immersion, in which you, the player, are absorbed into the role of the booth guy, Obra Dinn chooses to intentionally take a step back. The situation that you're looking into is already all played out and poses no threat to you. Again, you're just an insurance adjuster. Instead, the game embraces the role of you, both the player and the character, as a member of the audience, so the story chooses to constantly play with this distortion of the concept of dramatic irony. It seems to revel in the idea that you'll never have the full picture until the very end of the game, whereas all of the characters involved in the narrative know who every other character is and what's played out over the course of their voyage, and because it knows that you don't know, Obra Dinn is able to mess with how you perceive all of the characters throughout the whole experience. They'll inevitably make an early impression on you, maybe as a murderer or hero, but as you go through the rest of their past, it might completely shift your whole perspective on them, or it might not. It makes the characters even more interesting entirely because you'll see that they contain multitudes. So let's start looking into the mystery of the Obra Dinn properly. We inspect the first corpse on the deck and are immediately greeted with audio of an attempted mutiny, followed closely by the captain busting open his door and shooting the mutineers, seemingly to protect some kind of treasure. The cutscene cuts away and we're staring down the barrel of a gun. Okay, gameplay time. At its core, Return of the Obra Dinn is a puzzle game, and the puzzle in this case is completing the book. This is done by identifying the members of the ship's crew in the cutscenes and the causes of their deaths or disappearances. Some of them are very easy. For example, you should be able to easily intuit that the captain of the ship is the person shooting the gun in this instance, based only on the cutscene that just played, but others are far harder. We'll get to that later. Causes of death are even easier. Generally, you just have to look at the diorama that you're presented with to see, oh yeah, I think he was shot, and then deal with identifying the victims. Occasionally, this can be turned on its head through extremely tricky causes of death, but generally the puzzle is sussing out who's who on this boat. Of course, because there are only 60 puzzles, so to speak, in the game, it would have been way too easy to just guess and check as soon as you get the book. This guy looks like he has a captain's hat, he must be the captain, oh he's not, then he's the first mate, so on and so forth. So instead of just giving you the answer as soon as you put it in, you have to get 3 at once. There's a lot to like about this design choice in my opinion. It really instills a sense of momentum into going through the game because being unable to know if your deduction is correct encourages you to just keep pushing forwards, which naturally leads to you getting more clues as far as identifying people goes, which naturally leads to you being more comfortable with solving the puzzles. Because Obra Dinn does this, it completely dodges a really easy trap for puzzle games to fall into, where you get stuck on one puzzle that just doesn't quite click right with your brain, so you're able to properly appreciate the narrative and continue with the game's forwards movement, which just makes the whole experience better overall. Setting the threshold at 3 though also gives you a chance to do the guess and check method if necessary, especially since who died and how is very self-evident most of the time. If you're struggling with, say, identifying which of the Chinese top men is which, there's nothing wrong with just putting in various combinations of 3 until you happen to get it right, and the game even goes out of its way to say that this is a valid strategy. So let's look at an example of how the puzzles work and why they work so well. After a couple more scenarios in which we see the captain going John Wick mode, we get this scene.
Abigail, your brother, my friend, I shot him dead. I'll be with you soon, my love. Please forgive me for everything.
There are a couple of things to be noted here. First, he's talking to somebody named Abigail. Second, he says that he shot her brother / his friend. And third, see how he's feeling sad now? That's that morality bouncing around when we see that he feels regret for what he did. With the captain, Robert Witterell specifically, this is going to continue throughout the game because he's a very prominent and very interesting character. Back to the diorama. From here, we can use the crew manifest to see that the only person named Abigail on the ship is Abigail Hoskett Witterell, and if we're just looking at the characters in this scene, there's a dead lady in the bed nearby who we can naturally assume to be Abigail. Continuing from there, we can find that the first mate of the ship is named William Hoskett, and due to having the same last names, it's safe to assume that there's a familial relationship here. Knowing this, we can safely piece together that William Hoskett, the first mate of the Obra Dinn, was shot with a gun by Robert Witterell. The puzzle, in this case identifying William Hoskett, doesn't give you all of the pieces up front. Instead, you have to piece together a string of things to eventually get there, but the line of logic follows very smoothly through the process of getting the solution, meaning that the puzzle is solvable without too much sitting there and staring at a static monitor like a fool, while still being really satisfying to get. I've played Obra Dinn 5 or 6 times since its release in 2018, and on every single occasion it's still fun to piece this puzzle together. Now, that being said, it's very easy to mess up this type of puzzle design by not making the information clear enough, like making things that seem completely irrelevant actually be a key part of doing the identification. I want to look at another game for this. Professor Layton and the Azran Legacy Puzzle 002 is some of the dumbest shit that I've ever seen in a puzzle game. They give you what seems to be a math problem, mostly just unit conversions, so you do some basic math. 5 times 2000 over 30 equals 333.33 cups of water, and then that's wrong actually because you can only put 2 digits into the answer box. So you might sit there thinking maybe your math is wrong or maybe you're missing something in the clue, but it's all pretty straightforward and there's no way you messed up the math, so you do the classic Professor Layton strategy, just putting in 0 because sometimes that happens and then it's correct. What the hell? Well, here's the thing, you're a fucking idiot. And you didn't realize that the illustration that was accompanying the puzzle was actually the entire puzzle and not just fucking tone setting to indicate that you're in a wintry village because you're at the start of the game, and it's the goddamn fireplace that you can just barely see creeping over the girl's shoulder on your stupid ass 3DS's 240p screen that's just the entire solution to the puzzle. Trying to work back from what's developer intended, my best guess is that the use of decimals was supposed to indicate to the game's target audience that the math doesn't check out, but the thing is I don't balk at decimals because I'm an adult, so this clue slipped by me. Maybe it's also the fact that they used the term cups to describe what you're pouring, further obfuscating the math process by introducing irrelevant units. But again, I have no reason to assume that this isn't just a math problem, and that's the whole issue with this puzzle. It presents a ton of completely false or irrelevant information, hides the actual solution, says, "You're a smart fella, you figure it out," and it fucking sucks. Especially early in a game, you don't want to put in things like this because it makes the player think that there's going to be a ton of tricks and shit through the rest of the puzzles, which will change their whole perception of the game in a bad way, because there's no actual solving of a puzzle if the solution to the puzzle is to not properly engage with the puzzle. It just sucks. Obra Dinn doesn't do this, because Obra Dinn's puzzles, even when obtuse, are well designed. All the information you need is there so long as you look for it. There are 4 key methods to solving every person's identity, which I'll cover as they come up. Starting with puzzle solving method number 1, audio. This is easily the most obvious clue and will most likely serve as the basis for most of your solves before you've seen all of the death dioramas. A character will drop a name, you'll figure out who that's referring to, and then there's your solution. For example, in a later puzzle, a character will say,
Brennan! Bring the surgeon's kit!
And upon searching around, we can see the beanie guy that the captain slashed the throat of holding his ear as if to listen to his name being called. Thus, it's safe to assume that the beanie guy is Seaman Henry Brennan. You can also use accents and languages to your advantage. For example, the only Italian person on the ship says, "It's a me, Nunzio Pasqua," and because of his accent, we can safely assume that he's Nunzio Pasqua, the ship's musician. Or we can figure out which 3 of the characters are Russian because they're speaking in Russian about somebody in their card game cheating, which will at the very least help with future deductions. Along the same lines, let's talk about the sound design of the cutscenes. My god, it's so good. Every sound in the game is just perfect, so incredibly good at making you visualize the scene that it's like the visuals for the cutscenes are actually there. You can hear the mutineers banging on the door and perfectly visualize how it looks just based on where the corpse was located.
Captain! Open the door!
Kick it in.
Ah! Lest we break it down and take more than those shells!
You bastards may take exactly what I give you!
The storm in Chapter 7 causing so much noise and chaos that it's virtually impossible to hear the dialogue over it. The stowaway hyperventilating as you can hear the cargo falling to crush them. Only for the very next scene to be the scenario playing out outside of the stowaway's barrel.
Wait! No!
It's some of the best sound design I've heard in games. There's so much mood and ambiance conveyed through it, and it's all so slick that you really feel like you're on the ship watching these things play out, even though from a removed perspective, all you have is a series of static boxes in 2 colors. It feels like you can see it all happening right in front of you despite the fact that quite literally you can't, and that's entirely due to the beautiful sound design. Jumping back to that storm, this is the first death that really sets the tone for the whole misadventure. You heard Abigail going out into what seemed to be a torrential storm, and then when you cut into the diorama, yep, seems like the storm broke the mast and it gonked her on the head. Oh wait, actually, holy shit, that's a whole ass kraken attacking the ship, and it just used the mast to gonk Abigail on the head. Yeah, so if the mystery of what happened to the Obra Dinn wasn't already interesting enough, this'll almost definitely put you over the edge into being fully committed to seeing how this all played out. Of course, it's not that simple, as you'll probably realize from the story starting at the end. Literally, the chapter covering the last deaths of the crew is called The End. Return of the Obra Dinn's story is presented non-linearly, so there's an added element of mystery to the game in that you don't know how it all went down. What made the Kraken attack the ship, for example? Was it just an unfortunate coincidence that there was a big octopus looking for a boat to attack and the Obra Dinn just happened to be there, or was it something else? Along the same lines, how did people survive the Kraken attack to later be killed by Captain Witterell? It's constantly presenting new questions, and we're never given a perfect glimpse into how everything played out until the very end of the story, when the linchpin that makes everything click is revealed in the currently blocked Chapter 8. For now though, let's focus on the guy ripped in half in the Abigail death, and with him puzzle-solving method number 2, appearance. Many, if not most, of the characters won't be named, but oftentimes they have distinguishing traits that make them much more clearly identifiable as a certain person. When we look at the guy mid-rip, we can see that he has very prominent tattoos, something that nobody else on the boat does. This is an important appearance trait towards identifying you. From there we can check the crew log, and of everybody in the crew there was only one person who's from a part of the world that traditionally has tattoos like this. Thus we can identify this bisected man as Meba, the topman from New Guinea. We can also do this with clothes. For example, you can safely assume that the officers of the boat are the ones wearing nicer clothing, or the purser is most likely the guy wearing a cravat. This is also the key to one of the hardest sets of puzzles in the game, identifying the Chinese topman. What you're supposed to do is look at their shoes over time and cross-reference that with puzzle solving method number 3, which I'll get to shortly. Of course, you could also just brute force it because that's always a valid option. Another benefit of the game's nonlinearity is that despite the fact that the story, when played out linearly, is a constant ramp-up in tension, by jumping back and forward in the timeline there are natural lulls in action created here and there. We go from a Kraken assaulting the ship in Chapter 7 to more tranquil waters but an attempted mutiny taking place while a small group of people escape the ill-fated ship in Chapter 9, which by the way has another example of Witterell's morality going against our initial judgment of the captain as evil due to him encouraging the escapees to go.
Let them go!
And then from that, we zip all the way back to Chapter 2, in which a couple of people die from illness on the boat. Dying of disease is just something that can happen sometimes, so I don't think it really would have been something that the crew would have questioned. Knowing what we know now though, these two deaths are an omen of the bad things to come. Going back to the distorted dramatic irony thing from earlier, now we, the audience, are the ones in the know of what happens to them, which completely recontextualizes these early deaths from an unfortunate situation into a portent of calamity. While we're looking into these disease-based deaths, one of the biggest clues to a bunch of people's identities shows up. Puzzle-solving method number 3, environment. This time we're looking at what a character has and is often around. This includes other characters, or where they are on the ship, or what they're often using or holding onto, all three of which can provide key information towards what their position or job on the ship is. For example, the young-looking guy following the third mate around is probably the third mate's steward. The guys helping the butcher in the middle of the ship are midshipmen, and the guy holding the sketchbook is probably the artist. I really want to focus on the bed tags though, because these will play key parts in solving something like 12 different fates. If you look closely on the hammocks, there are a bunch of tags with numbers on them. Using the name given in the cutscene preceding this, Syed, we can check the crew manifest, notice that Solomon Syed was crew member number 54, notice that his bed tag was number 54, and from there we can piece together the identities of every single Indian seaman. This also gives key clues to the Chinese topmen. Remember I mentioned the shoes? Those are all poking out of their bunks with tags, so if we take careful note of whose shoes are which crew members, we can trace lines to which Chinese topmen survived until when to much more easily identify all of them. Or, alternatively, if you happen to forget the trick to solving the fates of the Chinese topmen since you last played the game, you could always just brute force it instead, because that's always still going to be an option. Skipping ahead a bit, let's go to Chapter 6 and talk about the music, which is great. In Papers, Please, the soundtrack is extremely limited, having a total of about 6 minutes of music throughout the whole thing, but it sets the tone when it needs to so incredibly well. The title screen approaching with the giant womp, 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 womp instantly establishes a feeling of a big, powerful entity, Arstatska, being a key part of the game, and sets up the idea that you're in somewhere kind of Soviet by using a style of music that's very reminiscent of that period in time, even though the region depicted in Papers, Please is fictional. Obra Dinn does both of these things, but better. The instrumentation is very orchestral, strings play a huge part as the focus of the music, you can hear harpsichords and violins and basses all over the place, which just feels fucking nautical. When it needs to set the tone, it does so flawlessly too. Prior to Abigail's death, you've been hearing songs that are aggressive but not too aggressive, appropriately balancing the end of the Obra Dinn's tragic trip with the fight to the death that's ensuing, but when the crew is staring down the Kraken, the music is these long-ass, deep-ass notes, creating this feeling of like a giant oppressing force slamming down on the ship that's about to kill everybody. My favorite song, though, is the one for Chapter 6, called Soldiers of the Sea. This is one of the chapters with the highest body counts, featuring the crew being attacked by a bunch of monsters riding giant crabs, so you'd assume that the music would have a similar oppressive vibe, but then it's almost jaunty. The use of bells or chimes or something and plucked strings puts this bounce into the song, completely changing the feeling of the scenario. We start this chapter by finding a corpse tucked into the side of the boat who died while trying to hide from the attacking monsters due to an unfortunate crossfire accident, which is about as tragic as it gets. But the music is almost a rallying cry that gets you to instead focus on the fight against the giant enemy crabs. Now you're rooting for the crew to defeat them. It's completely upended your perspective on the whole situation in such a strong way. Now all these characters that you might not have cared about are getting decapitated by crabs or setting themselves on fire to kill them, and you can't help but think, these motherfuckers are heroes.
Boy! In there somewhere! Storm's coming! Finish your business and climb down here!
Once we've found enough of the corpses, we can piece together most of the story. To keep it as short as possible, here's how it went down. The Obra Dinn was transporting a small group of Formosan, modern-day Taiwan, royalty with some kind of treasure. On the journey, the second mate, Edward Nichols, tried to steal it, but this failed when a bunch of mermaids attacked the rowboats he and a small detachment took to sell the treasure. After one of the Formosans used the treasure, a shell, to stop the mermaids' attack, sacrificing himself in the process, Nichols rowed back to the Obra Dinn, got killed because he was responsible for the deaths of 3 of the 4 Formosans, and the crew hoisted the mermaids that Nichols brought as a bargaining chip back on board, placing them in the lazarette along with the shell. Not fond of being held captive, the mermaids summon crabs and a kraken to attack the ship and free them. Something in Chapter 8 happens to stop the attacks, and then interpersonal issues result in the end of the Obra Dinn's crew. When you look at it this way, it's a very simple story. No huge twists, pretty simple through line for the plot, but because the story is presented in a way that keeps everything from you until the very end, it becomes very intriguing. Hell, we don't even know what stopped the attack at this point, so the mystery is still really present, even though we've seemingly found all that there is to find. Speaking of finding all that there is to find, the fourth and final puzzle-solving method, proximity. This is generally one of the less useful methods, but there are still identities that are best determined this way. By using the sketches, we can figure out if characters are standing in groups of other people in their position, and then use that to determine who unidentified people in that clique are. We can see most of the already identified stewards standing over to the left side of the Justice at Sea sketch, as well as one unidentified guy who's wearing the same outfit, and thus it's safe to assume that this is Zungi Sathi, the ship's steward. Along similar lines, we can see a group of topmen in the underway sketch, which includes the potentially as yet unidentified guy that got gonked by Captain Witterell all the way back in the 3rd scene. This lets us assume that he's one of the few as yet unidentified topmen, and he doesn't look Chinese, so he's probably Topman Lewis Walker. So if you take these 4 methods, every single puzzle in Obra Dinn is completely solvable without any stupid fireplace tricks. Some of them require more careful scrutiny, naturally, but when you realize that you have all of the pieces you need to fit everything together, the whole puzzle clicks right into place.
Can you believe it? A package at this hour? Oh, the thing smells just dreadful. Better you don't open it inside. I'll be turning in now. Tea's in the kitchen if you need more.
If you succeed in revealing the fates of 58 of the 60 people on board the Obra Dinn, you're sent a package from the survivors containing the last thing you need to get the full picture, a monkey's paw. Put a pin in that, it's a symbol of the plot that's relevant to this chapter. So, in Chapter 8, we finally see what stopped the storm. Captain Robert Witterell made a deal with the captive mermaids, saying that he'll set them free if they call off the Kraken and see that the Obra Dinn safely returns home. 2 of the 3 mermaids die in the negotiation process, that's just how it goes sometimes, but the 3rd seems to oblige, being set free as a result, and Witterell eventually throws the shell overboard, which we can see glimmering in the sea off the boat when we show up to insurance adjust it. 2 things. First, we're given even more of a view on Witterell's morals, because we see that he did ultimately want to save the crew far more than he cared about any treasure. Over the course of the whole game, all he's done is make good choices, so at this point it's really not hard to see him as a good guy rather than the villain that the final incident made him out to be. It's giving these characters moral complexity. The same thing happens with Henry Brennan, throat slashed, who at first just seems to be a part of the violence that killed the last remnants of the Obra Dinn, but both of the times he killed a crewman, he assumes that he was doing the right thing in clubbing a perceived mutineer and executing a perceived murderer. It's very impressive that the game is able to make these characters, who we only see for a few brief moments at a time, and generally in the midst of somebody being brutalized, into something complex that you actually grow to like. Ironically, it's probably kind of bad for the game in a way, because making characters in a game where you have to identify characters really imprint themselves in your brain makes it a lot harder to forget them and replay the game. I still do, don't get me wrong, but every time I can remember more and more characters, and I have to take a longer and longer break in between replaying Obra Dinn. Second, remember that monkey's paw? The meaning of it, from a symbolic perspective, is when something happens that's good on a surface level, but there's some kind of twist on the outcome that makes the result just as bad as if the thing didn't happen. In this case, it's that Witterell and most of the rest of the crew still die. The request that he made was for the Obra Dinn specifically to return, not the crew on board. While it's up to interpretation whether they would have been able to weather the Kraken attack, the crew ultimately traded their lives for the boat's safe return, in the process making many of their loved ones' lives worse, as many of the crewmen's estates were forced into heavy fines as a result of some asshole insurance adjuster swooping in with all the grisly details of the boat trip to screw them over too. It's one final cherry on top of a sundae comprised entirely of cruel twists of fate, monkey's paw, and judging by the fact that the ship's doctor died of an illness in the relatively few years between the main story and sending the book to the insurance adjuster, it might not be over yet. Return of the Obra Dinn is absolutely incredible. This is the type of game that 10, 20, 30 years down the line, people will look back at as an inflection point in its genre, something that completely changed the whole perception of what puzzle games can do. Even if the gameplay of it isn't your thing, Obra Dinn takes so many incredibly bold swings from so many angles, and every single time it knocks them out of the park. The graphic style, if it were executed poorly, would be terrible, but it so perfectly fits the tone of the game's story. Said story could completely collapse due to being nonlinear. It would have been easy to either screw it up by making it too easy to piece together and ruining the need for nonlinearity, or too hard to piece together and ruining the whole point of nonlinearity, but it nails the thin margin between the two for something that's compelling, mysterious, exciting, and at the same time, completely makes sense. If and when something comes along that surpasses it, the mark that Return of the Obra Dinn made on the genre will be indelible. Return of the Obra Dinn is a fat 10 out of 10.